Hey guys, so this is How to Do by Lou, and today we'll be doing rear brakes on this '06 Solara. Customer ended up complaining about the rubbing noise in the rear, and then guessing it needs rear brakes. And if you look here, most likely we'll need a right rear caliper. This rotor is totally ground down, and if you look inside, there is no pad left, which the brake pad is right here. Then, if you go to the other side, this rotor looks completely fine, and there's plenty of brake pad right down in there. So I'm guessing it probably also needs a right rear caliper. Alright, so now we'll be taking the wheel off in order to check these brakes. I'll take my 3/8 impact gun, and this one should be a 14mm bolt to hold the caliper on. So on this caliper, they have caliper slides that are integral with the caliper bolt. That one came out nice and easy, so I'm guessing that the slides aren't what's causing it to stick. Oh, the bottom one is extremely hard to get off. That could be part of the culprit. Let's see. Nope, that one's not rusty. Still has good grease on it. But normally, if you're just changing the brakes, you take these out, clean them up, and put new grease on them. You'd want to use something like Glide, and this is really good for caliper slides, and this is different than your typical brake grease, and this you normally want to put on the pads or the caliper bracket right where the contact points are. This is high temp chromoly grease. This is high temp just silicone grease. And here's the brakes on the side of the caliper that was stuck. As you can see, there's no more friction material left. It's just straight steel. And sometimes people get their rotors cut, but usually when they start grinding, it doesn't have enough material anyways. So in this case, we're gonna replace the rotors. And now I'm just double checking to see if this caliper pushes in, and it should push in by hand with this tool. And I'm pushing as hard as I can, and it won't move. So it definitely needs a new right rear caliper. Also, usually people replace these calipers in pairs just to alleviate any kind of brake pulls or any other abnormal things that may happen with one good caliper and one bad caliper. Okay, so now it's time to take the caliper off. And what I'll do, sometimes especially if I want to save some time, I'll take this tool and I'll pinch the brake hose, and this will keep the fluid from constantly running out when you're changing the caliper. Even when you take it off, not a lot comes out. Next, I'll take I believe it's a 12mm socket. I'll undo the brake hose. Just like so. And dump the fluid. So, at the bottom of the page, I'll put a link for some places that you might be able to get some good brake parts. On this one, we'll be getting a remanufactured caliper, so this caliper will be going back. Next, we will take the caliper bracket off. Take my light, because the bolt can be hard to see back here. Should be a 14, it is. Like that. Take the trusty old impact gun. There's one bolt. And And here's the next bolt. And there's the caliper bracket with the other pad left in there, which you can see has a tiny bit of friction material left on it, but almost nothing. And this will go back with the caliper core. Next comes the brake rotor. This one's nice and loose. Usually they'll get very rusty around the center, and you might have to put something like some PB Blaster or some other kind of penetrating oil to get this off. And you might even need to hammer it. And when you're taking this off, you want to be very careful not to pull the e-brake shoes out while you're undoing the rotor, because there's little pins back here that will break. And if you pull them out, then you'll need either new pins, or sometimes they'll even pull it through this backing plate when it's too rusty. And then you actually have a serious problem. Another thing, now that I think about it with this rotor, a sure sign of knowing when it's stuck is when you see this rust on here that looks more red than your typical rust. So normally rust has a color like this, you know, regular brown. If you look at this, it has that red tint to it. And that's what rust does when it gets overheated. And you can also look, this is all blue, obvious signs of overheating. Next, while I'm in here, I might as well just take a quick look at the e-brake stuff, the shoes, make sure everything is pretty good. If you really want to take an extra step, you can put a little grease behind on the contact points, and then it would alleviate squeaking when you use the e-brake. Next, we take this out, check out the sealing surface on this hose, and we'll be replacing these little copper washers, which one goes on each side of the bolt. Also, this is called a banjo fitting, and that bolt is called a banjo bolt. So there's the washer, and then right here we'll normally clean it off nice and smooth, make sure it gets a good sealing surface. So one thing I like to do for speed reasons is take my right angle grinder. I'll take a roll-lock disc, which they're pretty forgiving and don't take away too much material. They also don't scratch the surface much at all too, so it's great for cleaning. Get it all clean. And basically you want to do it until it's completely smooth when you touch it with your finger. Alright, so now it comes time to actually put the brakes back together. I'm going to take my disc brake quiet. I like to use the CRC one, but they have all different kinds. And you take your brake pads, and what the disc brake quiet does is it helps eliminate harmonic vibrations, which most of the time when you hear brakes squeaking, it's because of the harmonic vibrations going through the pads, not because they're low or half the time it's because they're low and they have a squealer, but usually it's because of harmonic vibrations. Basically the pad vibrating against the bracket, causing it to sound like a squeak when it's actually a vibration. So you spray this on the back sides of the pads. It's basically like tacky spray. So just a light coat. You don't want to get it on the friction surface because it'll contaminate it. Here's our new bag of hardware, which will save. Then your rotors, new rotors, which come coated in a light coating of oil so they don't rust. And you spray them with your brake cleaner. I normally do it with one hand and hold it in the center, that way I won't be touching where the pads will touch with my dirty hands. And you wipe any areas where friction material will be touching. So that includes the inner and outer lips of the rotor, and then where the e-brake runs on the inside, it will spray and wipe down. And that'll be the first rotor, which will go up here. Then when you do this, you want to line up on these Toyota Solaras. There's a hole in the hub right here, which you want to line up with the hole in the rotor. Once again, I'll be taking this hole for the e-brake adjuster and line it up with a big hole here. If you look here, you can see when they do get stuck, you go through this hole, and that goes to the star wheel adjuster, which is right there, right in there. There's the star, and that you would back off, and that would get your shoes unstuck from the insides of the rotor. Put your next rotor on. Sometimes people put grease right here if they're getting corroded and stuck. This one came off nice and easily, so doesn't need the grease. Has a little lube on there anyway. Next, you'll take your caliper, which comes with a little bag of goodies. Here's your new banjo bolt and your new copper gaskets for it, which these will get installed, and you always want to replace them so you're not risking getting a leak. It even came with a second one. Sometimes they'll come with the second one when they can't make the threads the same exact as the threads in the car, and they'll give you another one which you should probably use in case it's different. Sometimes they do it in the remanufacturing process because it could have been cross-threaded or stripped and they had to make a bigger hole or fix up the hole that's there. Then this caliper came with its own hardware, which I won't be using. I'll be using the hardware that came with the pads just for consistency reasons. So that way it'll have the same hardware on both sides and not hardware that came with the caliper and hardware that came with the pads. So next, I'll take my caliper. First, grab my air hose. And you have to disassemble the caliper, the new one. Take the slide bolts out, which come pre-greased, so no need for new grease. But then, we'll take the caliper grease and put the light coating right on the contact points. Very light, just enough to prevent corrosion. Not using it for actual lube right here. Very light coating. No gobs, because it'll get soft when they heat up and leak onto the rotor sometimes. But extremely light. You just see it's just coated. Oh, missed a little spot. Now I'll keep it from rusting and getting stuck again. And you take your new hardware, put that on here, making sure it's centered and that the inner tabs aren't going to touch your rotor. Put the new hardware on this side. And once again, your light coating of grease, and this time this is stainless, so it doesn't really corrode, but the grease will help lube it. So these come with grease on them, all new, so I'll leave them as they are. Next comes your caliper bracket. So I'll take these bolts. I put a little Loctite on them just because they're smaller, and it's a crucial component that you do not want to come off. So now, just in case I was unsure, if you're ever actually unsure, at this point you'd take a torque wrench and look the torque up. make sure you're torquing these bolts properly, because last thing you want is for your caliper to come off, especially while someone's braking. That felt about 70. Here's 70. That's 70 also. Next. So then I'll tighten these rear caliper bracket bolts. These are usually about 70 foot-pounds on this particular car, but my gun is pretty trusty and tested. The setting I have is probably right around there. New pads, put them in their home, and then when you're doing this, you want to make sure the pads will easily move with your fingers. You don't want to have to force them, because then it's starting off stuck. And you don't want them to be extremely loose, because then you have the risk of the harmonic vibration. So it's basically, you know, pretty loose to move, but not too loose. And then on this one, you could tell I can't push it in with my fingers. Sometimes this happens. Usually it's manufacturing that causes it. And in this case, it is most likely happening because this is painted and this is painted. So what I'll do is just grind it down a little tiny bit. Make sure I can get it to fit in perfectly. So I'll just use some of these sanding discs that you get on Amazon. Then, because I ground it, you want to take a little grease, put it over there so that way it won't rust. Then put it back in, fits nice and easy. Now I can move it nice and easily with my fingers. Next, you take the caliper, new caliper. Usually this one will go in the top with the rubber. Put your caliper on, line up these rubber boots, and you stick your slide right through and just start it by hand. And you go to the other side. Okay, line up the boot, stick the slide in, and then tighten it by hand. Here's a little light in case you guys couldn't see that. These boots like to move off to the side, so you gotta line them up. Next, take my trusty impact pen. This is also a 14 millimeter. And these you want to be about 25 to 30 foot-pounds. Once again, I'll check it by hand and make sure it's not over or under tightened. Right here would be a good place for a torque wrench too, if you're unsure. That's good. Good. Lastly, for this caliper, you need to hook up the brake hose, which goes in the back. I'll take the bolt that came with it. The bolt that came with it, just in case the threads are different, because that happens. You take your new banjo bolt, put your copper washer on one side, put it through your freshly cleaned banjo fitting, grab your other copper washer, put that guy on, then you attach it right to the back of the caliper, and on this particular one it has this little piece that sticks out, and that goes into a hole, and that's what lines it up. Then you take that, tighten her down. Not too tight. That one's probably about 20 foot-pounds normally. Then, once that's all tightened, you can take your hose pliers off. That'll let the fluid back through. And then you open your bleeder screw. And there's several different kinds of ways to bleed the brakes. Sometimes you can get away with just opening it and waiting till it drips out and then close it, and then it will be bled. Sometimes they're a lot more difficult. The brake fluid is starting to drip out of the bleeder screw, which means it's totally gravity bled. I don't see any air bubbles coming out. But one thing to just do an extra, I'll take my vacula, which is basically like a power bleeder, hook it to the bleeder screw, and then I'll suck out any more fluid. Then you can see it coming through. And halfway through, I know fluid's coming out of it, I'll close it. And that's the quickest way you could probably bleed it.